Welcome back to Hot Air with me, Joshua Robert. And this week, there's a headline going around that the Olympics has banned trans women from competing. And depending on who you ask, this is either about protecting fairness in sports or it's something a lot deeper, a lot messier, and honestly, a lot more uncomfortable. Because when you really start pulling on this conversation, it stops being about sports very quickly. It becomes about gender, power, fear, control, and how people react when something challenges what they thought they understood about the world or what they've been told about the world. So today, we're going to slow this all down. We're going to take a very long, deep breath and we're going to actually walk through it step by step. What's really happening, why it's happening, why people feel so strongly about it, and what this whole conversation might actually be revealing about all of us. When I first heard this news that the Olympics was banning only trans women from competing and they would be testing female athletes to ensure that their DNA was in fact female biologically at birth, the first thing that came to my mind was that it's more than that. It is so much deeper. This says so much about society, about people who believe that this is correct. And wherever you fall on the spectrum of believing that trans people should not be allowed to play in sports, there's so much more to this. Like, we're literally going to get down to the DNA of it all today. And before we do, make sure you're following me on Instagram and TikTok at _hotairpod. Go over to my website, hotairwithjoshuarobert.com, to shop my merch, submit your listener stories, and share your topic suggestions. And stick around for the very end of this episode because I have a fun little announcement. And with all that being said, buckle the fuck up because we are getting into the nitty gritty today. Let's hit it. Part 1. What's actually happening? So let's start with the facts, because the internet has a habit of taking something complicated and turning it into a one-sentence panic attack. You've probably seen people saying the Olympics has banned trans women. Full stop, end of story. But the reality is a little bit more nuanced than that, and honestly, that nuance matters if we're going to have a real conversation instead of just yelling at each other online. The International Olympic Committee, also known as the IOC, has not issued a single universal ban across all sports. What they've actually done is shift the responsibility to individual sports federations. So instead of one rule that applies to everyone, each sport like swimming, track and field, cycling can create its own policies around transgender athletes. And those policies often focus on things like testosterone levels, whether an athlete has gone through male puberty, and what they define as fair competitive advantage. Now, the reasoning they gave is centered around fairness. That's the word you're going to hear over and over and over again. Fairness, fairness, fairness. The idea is that certain physical advantages, particularly those developed during male puberty, could carry over even after transitioning, and that could impact competition in women's sports. So from their perspective, this isn't about identity. It's about trying to maintain a level playing field. But here's where things start to get complicated, because what sounds simple on the surface to some, keep things fair, is actually built in a lot of assumptions. Assumptions about bodies, about performance, about what counts as an advantage and what does not. And if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, you realize that elite sports have never been fair in a perfectly equal sense. That's kind of the point. Some people are taller and faster and stronger, have better genetics, better training, better access to resources. Michael Phelps literally has a body that produces less lactic acid than most humans. Should we ban him for being too perfectly built for swimming? Where exactly are we drawing this line? And that's the tension that is sitting underneath all of this. Because on one hand, yes, sports organizations are trying to create rules that, according to them, feel fair. That is their perspective, not mine. But on the other hand, those rules are being built in a space where fairness has never actually been clean or consistent. It's always been messy and it's always involved some level of advantage. Like when people are scouting the next big athlete, football, for example, they're looking for someone big. If they're a linebacker or something, I don't know. Big, muscular, wide. Like they're going to pick people with the most optimal body types. And another important piece here is that the number of transgender athletes competing at the Olympic level is extremely small. We're not talking about hundreds of athletes dominating every sport. We're talking about a tiny, tiny group of people who are now at the center of a massive global debate. And that disconnect between how big the conversation is and how small the actual population is, that's something we're going to come back to because it matters. But when I look this up, there is not a single trans athlete that is aiming to be a part of the 2028 Olympics. So, not even sure why they're doing this. So, when you hear the Olympics has banned trans women, what's actually happening is more like this. Individual sports are creating stricter rules around who can compete in women's categories, often focusing on biology, hormones, and development. And those rules are being framed as necessary for fairness, even though the definition of fairness itself is still very much up for debate. Listen, you're allowed to sit with that. You're allowed to feel like, okay, I get why people are asking these questions, but you also have to be honest about the fact that these policies don't just exist in a vacuum. They exist in a cultural moment where people have very strong feelings about gender. And those feelings absolutely influence how these rules are being created and received. Because this isn't just a sports policy conversation, it's a human conversation. And once you realize that, everything starts to feel a little less black and white. And I would just like to say, even though, according to what I have researched and read, the Olympics has not outright put a policy in that says no trans women and, supposedly put it back to the sports, they're enabling these sports because that everyone is going to jump on board. That just the Olympics, it's like just the Olympics stating this and that they were going to be testing female athletes to ensure that they are indeed born female in the first place. Every other category of sport is gonna follow suit. So regardless of whether the Olympics has put it into play or they've allowed the different sports committees for whatever fucking sport to make the choice, the reality is that they are banning trans women from competing, no matter how you look at it. Part 2, why people are scared or confused. Let's talk about the reaction, because if you've been online for even 5 minutes, you already know people are not calm about this, and they're not calm about anything that has to do with the trans community. And instead of just writing that off as ignorance or hate, I think it's actually more useful and honestly more interesting to ask why. Why does this topic make people so uncomfortable? And why does it feel so charged? I don't get it because I have trans acquaintances and I've never been made uncomfortable. I've never questioned their identity. I've just been like, they are who they are. But it really intrigues me to try to understand why people are made so very uncomfortable by this topic. A lot of it comes down to something that is very simple. People are scared of what they do not understand. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. I mean it in a very human way. For most of our lives, we've been taught gender is binary. There is male, there is female. That is it. 2 boxes. Pick one, you're done, move on. And for a long time, that framework felt stable. It felt like something you didn't have to question. But now, in 2026, the framework is being challenged. And when something that feels foundational suddenly becomes flexible, it can make people feel a bit unsteady. They're like, wait, if this isn't as simple as I thought, what else isn't as simple as I thought? And instead of leaning into that curiosity, a lot of people respond with fear because fear is easier than uncertainty. There's also something called cognitive dissonance, which is basically what happens when new information conflicts with what you already believe. Your brain does not love that. It wants things to make sense. It wants things to be consistent. So when you are presented with something that doesn't fit neatly into your existing understanding, your instinct isn't always to explore it. It is usually to reject it. And then you add media into the mix, and suddenly everything feels bigger, louder, and more urgent than it actually is. Because the truth is, most people don't personally know a transgender athlete or a transgender human. Many people don't even personally have a concept of what it's like to be transgender or even interact with somebody that is trans. So their entire understanding of this topic is coming from headlines, social media clips, and very intense online debates. And when that's your only exposure, it's easy to start thinking that this is some massive, widespread issue that's happening everywhere all the time. It's easy to start thinking that it's a widespread issue that's happening everywhere, but it is not. It's just being talked about like it is. And here is the thing: confusion itself is not the problem. It's okay to not fully understand something. That is normal. The problem is what people do with that confusion. Do you ask questions? Do you try to learn? Or do you jump straight to judgment and fear? A lot of what we're seeing right now is people taking that initial discomfort and turning it into certainty. Certainty that something is very wrong, that something is unfair, that something needs to be stopped. And once people feel certain, it becomes really hard to have a nuanced conversation and show them the other side. There's also this underlying fear of change, not just change in sports, but change in society. Because gender isn't just a personal identity, it's something that's being tied to roles, to expectations, power structures, the list goes on and on. So when gender becomes more fluid, it doesn't just change biology, it changes the systems. And that can feel very threatening to people, even if they can't fully explain why. And I think it's important to say this very clearly. Not everyone who has questions or concerns is coming from a place of hate. Some people are genuinely trying to understand, although they may not always ask questions in what we might deem as the correct way. But there's a difference between asking questions and making assumptions. And right now, a lot of the loudest voices in this conversation are not even asking questions. They are not inquiring. They are making declarations as if they have a fucking clue what it is like to be trans, as if they studied the science. They have not. And frankly, they don't know anything. And when that happens, the conversation stops being about understanding at all, and it just starts being about control. Because, for example, when the president says that they're putting a stop to transgender health care because it is wrong and there's no such thing, what did he say in his, I think, was it his inauguration speech or one of his, I think it was his inauguration speech when he said he was going to make sure that there was only male and female in this country. God, I still can't even believe those words were said aloud. But when someone of that magnitude makes that declaration, people are going to follow suit. And those people are not going to ask questions. They're not going to interact with trans people and try to understand them. They're not going to talk about a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about in this episode to understand the spectrum of gender. That is fact-based and science-based. If the president doesn't do that research and has no fucking clue, then nobody else that supports him is going to either. So if you're listening to this and you're like, yeah, I feel a little confused about everything, that's okay. That's actually like a decent place to start. Confusion means you're aware that there's more to learn. If you're confused, it means you have at least opened your mind to a perspective that you are not used to. It just means you have not shut the door. So confusion is actually a good thing. But if that confusion turns into fear, and that fear turns into judgment, and that judgment turns into policy, that's when it starts to impact real people in very real ways. And that is why this conversation today matters. Part 3, the numbers. So now that we've kind of covered what's actually happening, why people are reacting so strongly, we need to ground this conversation in something that tends to be completely lost in all the noise, which is reality. Specifically, numbers. Because if you only listen to the internet, you would think that transgender athletes are dominating every sport, taking over competitions and completely reshaping the athletic world as we know it. I mean, I would be here for that. I would be somebody who would own and wear jerseys, but that's not the case. Like it's some kind of full-scale takeover is the way it's being portrayed in the news and the media. And I'm going to be honest, that perception doesn't fucking match reality at all. Not even a little tiny bit. So let's start with the basics. Transgender people make up a very small percentage of the entire population. Estimates vary slightly depending on the study, but generally, we're talking about somewhere between 0.5%, so 0.5 to maybe 1% of people in the United States. That is it. That's the group we're talking about. They are still important, but they are a small group. And already, that should shift the way you're thinking about this conversation. Because when something affects such a small percentage of people, but is being talked about constantly, it usually means something else is going on underneath the surface. Now let's narrow that down even further. Within that small percentage of transgender individuals, only a fraction are athletes. And within that already tiny group, that fraction of athletes, only a very small number are competing at elite levels. And when we're talking about the Olympics, we are talking about an extremely, extremely small number of people that are even trying to get there. Not dozens, not hundreds, like a handful, maybe if you are lucky. Think of it this way. The entire population of the world, let's say, right? How many is it? Is it 8 billion? Something like that. I'm going to do this math live and in person, okay? Googling, what is the world's population? 8.3 billion, okay? 8.3 billion. How many Olympic athletes are there in the Summer Olympics total? Okay, so there are about 10,000 to 11,000 athletes competing in the Summer Olympics in 2024. So if 8.3 billion is 100% of the population, what percentage of the population is 11,000 people? So we go 11,000 times 100 divided by 8 billion equals 0.000137. If my math is correct, that's the percentage of the population that is in the Olympics. That's even less than the percentage of the population that is actually trans. So, hypothetically, let's say 0.000137 is the total percentage of Olympic competitors in the Summer Olympics. 1% of that 1% of that would be trans. I don't even think I can do that math. I don't even know if this math is mathing. I don't even know if this is making any sense. So let me get back to the facts. But I think you get the fucking drift here. It's like such a minuscule number that why is this conversation so big? No trans people are coming for you. So basically, what I'm trying to say is when people frame this as a massive issue that is threatening the integrity of sports on a global scale, you have to pause and ask, does the size of the reaction match the size of the reality? Because right now, it does not. And this is where things get very, very interesting. Because when a conversation becomes this loud and this emotional and this widespread and about such a small group of people, it's usually not just about the numbers. Otherwise, people wouldn't be freaking out about it. It's about what those people represent. It's about what they challenge. It's about the discomfort they create in systems that were built to be simple and now being forced to become more complex. Another important piece here is performance, because there is this assumption that transgender women are consistently dominating women's sports, that they are winning everything, breaking records, and pushing out cisgender women entirely. But when you actually look at the data, that pattern doesn't really exist in the way that people think it does. There are a few high-profile cases that get a lot of attention, but those cases get amplified so much that they start to feel like the norm when they're actually the exception. And that's something the internet is very good at, taking a rare situation and making it feel like it's happening everywhere all the time. Take gay marriage, for instance. Like, the gay population, the queer population is a small population in comparison to everyone out there that is straight, and they're trying to take the rights away from us so we cannot get married and have even those legal rights that come along with traditional marriage. But they're focusing on such a small population and making it into this big issue as if we're like, I don't know, trying to take over their fucking churches or something. Well, you have one viral clip, one controversial like race, one headline, and suddenly it feels like this is defining issues in sports. But again, the numbers do not support that. I think it's important to sit with that for like 1,200 seconds because like it changes the tone, or it should change the tone. If this were truly widespread, if there were hundreds of trans athletes dominating every single sport, then like there would be more statistics to look at, and maybe you could argue that this is a systemic issue that needs some type of attention. I don't know, but that's not what we're seeing. We don't even have the data. We don't even have the patterns to look at this and say that trans people have an advantage. What we're seeing is a very small number of people being placed under an incredibly large microscope. When that happens, it raises another question. If the impact is statistically small, why is the reaction so damn big? Why are we pouring so much energy into regulating this specific group? Well, there are so many other issues in sports that don't get nearly the same level of attention. Things like unequal funding, lack of access, pay gaps, training resources, like those are widespread, measurable, ongoing issues that affect large numbers of athletes, and yet they don't seem to spark the same level of urgency. If this was actually about fairness for women, they would get paid the same as their male counterparts in their sport. So it makes you wonder, is this really about fairness in competition, or is it about something else that feels bigger, more emotional, and harder to articulate? When the volume of the conversation does not match the size of the population, usually means we're not just reacting to reality. We're reacting to perception, and perception, especially when it's shaped by fear and misunderstanding, can be very, very powerful. This is not about dismissing concerns entirely. It's about putting them into a correct context. It's about asking whether the scale of the response is proportional to the scale of the issue. And right now, we're having a massive cultural debate about a very small number of people. And that doesn't mean the conversation is not important. Do not get me wrong. It is important. I think it's important for other reasons. It just means we need to be honest about what we're actually reacting to. If we're not, we risk building policies and opinions and entire narratives around something that isn't as big as we think it is. Well, we're missing the bigger picture entirely. Part 4, fairness versus policing bodies. Let's talk about the word that keeps showing up in this conversation over and over again, fairness. Because on the surface, it sounds reasonable. It sounds logical. Of course, we want sports to be fair. That's kind of the whole point. But the second you start asking what fair actually means, things get a lot less clear. Fairness in sports has never been absolute. It has never meant that every single athlete is starting from the exact same place. That's just not how human bodies work, and it's not how competition works. Some people are naturally stronger. Some people are taller. Some people have better endurance, faster recovery, better muscle composition. Genetics play a massive role in athletic performance, and we don't regulate most of that. We celebrate it. We literally build entire careers around people who are biologically exceptional. That's what elite sports are. It's a collection of people who are, in some way, physically different from the average person. So when we suddenly start drawing a line and saying this advantage is okay, but this one is not, you have to ask, based on what? Because if fairness was truly about eliminating all advantages, we would have to completely redesign sports from the ground up. We would need categories for height, for weight, for wingspan, for lung capacity, access to training, economic background, you name it. And obviously, we don't do that because at some point we accept that advantage is a part of the game. That is a part of competition. So the question becomes, why is this specific type of perceived advantage being singled out in such an intense way? And this is where the conversation shifts from fairness into something else, which is control. Because when we talk about regulating who can compete, we're not just talking about performance. We are talking about bodies. We're talking about who gets to exist in a certain space and then under what conditions. And that's a very, very different conversation. Now it's not just, is this fair? It's who gets to decide what counts as fair and what criteria are we using to make that decision? Is it hormones? Is it chromosomes? Is it physical development? And what happens when those things don't line up in a neat, predictable way? And the truth is, they often don't. But instead of acknowledging that complexity, there's a tendency to try to simplify it, to create rules that feel clear and definitive, even if they don't fully capture reality, because clarity feels safer than ambiguity. It feels easier to enforce, easier to explain, easier to defend. Simplicity doesn't always equal accuracy. And that's the tension that we are sitting with right now and what feels like we're going to be sitting with for a while. On one hand, there's this genuine desire to protect fairness in women's sports, and that's important. Sure, fairness in general, yes. Women's sports have historically been underfunded, undervalued, and overlooked. So the idea of protecting that space, the idea of it matters. But on the other hand, the way we're trying to protect it raises some serious questions about how we define womanhood, how we measure fairness, and who gets excluded in the process. When you start policing bodies at this level, it rarely stays contained to just one group. It expands, it affects more people than intended, and it often ends up reinforcing the very inequalities it claims to prevent. I think that's where a lot of people start to feel uncomfortable, even if they can't fully explain why, because deep down there's a sense that this isn't just about competition. It is about drawing boundaries. And once those boundaries are drawn, they have real consequences for real people. So when someone says this is just about fairness, it is worth asking simply, is it really? Or is fairness being used as a way to justify something that's actually far more complicated? And coming from people who don't actually understand, have made no effort to understand. Fairness is not a fixed concept. It is something that we defined. And how we define it says a lot about what we value, what we fear, and who we are willing to include or exclude. Part 5. Misogyny, transphobia, and who we see as a threat. Now, we're going to talk about something that sits underneath this entire conversation, but doesn't always get said out loud, and that is the very specific way this issue is being framed. If you pay attention, the focus is almost always on one group, trans women, not trans men, not both equally, just trans women, and that is not random. If this entire conversation was purely about fairness in sports, then logically, we would be looking at all transitions, all directions, all possible advantages, but we are not. We are hyper-focused on people who were assigned male at birth and transitioned to female, and the concern is that they might be too strong, too fast, too dominant. And I need you to think about that for a second, because that framing reveals everything. Why are we so focused on only trans women? The underlying belief here, whether people realize it or not, is that masculinity equals power and femininity equals weakness. That the only way a women's category could be threatened is if someone who was once male enters it. But the reverse, someone assigned female at birth, transitioning to male, that's not treated with the same urgency, the same fear, or the same level of scrutiny. And that fucking tells you everything. I'm getting worked up now. What it suggests is that we don't actually believe women are strong enough on their own. We believe that they need to be protected from masculinity. And while that might sound like support on the surface, if you really don't think or use your brain ever, it's actually rooted in that very old, very persistent idea that women are inherently less capable. That's where this starts to overlap with misogyny. Historically, women's bodies have always been policed, controlled, and questioned, especially in sports. Women who didn't look feminine enough, women who were too muscular, too fast, too different. The fuck you expect from them? They're athletes. They have to be strong. They've been scrutinized, tested, and sometimes excluded. Not because they did anything wrong, but because they didn't fit a very narrow idea of what a woman is supposed to look like. So when we see policies that focus heavily on testing women, regulating women, verifying women, it's not happening in a vacuum. I say that a lot, don't I? What is with me in vacuums? It's part of a much larger pattern. And then you layer in the transphobia, and the conversation gets way more heated because now it's not just about controlling women's bodies, it's about questioning whether certain women are really women at all, just based on your fucking eyeballs. And that's where things start to get personal, honestly, very harmful, and very, the only word I can think of it's just bullshit. Think about what's being implied. That someone's identity, their body, their entire existence can be reduced to a set of criteria that somebody else is going to define. That there is a checklist somewhere that determines whether you qualify as who you say you are. And if you don't meet it, you're out. I understand that sports need categories. I understand that competition requires some level of structure. But the way that this is being handled raises questions about whose bodies are being scrutinized the most and why. And let's be real, no one is lining up male athletes and saying, okay, prove to us that you are biologically male. That's not happening. There's no widespread testing, no public debate about whether men might have unfair advantages over other men based on their biology. And yet when it comes to women, suddenly there's this intense need to verify, to test, to confirm. And that imbalance really is not accidental. It reflects a deeper belief system about gender, power, and who is allowed to take up space. When a woman is perceived as too strong and too fast or too dominant, people start asking questions. They start looking for explanations. They start trying to figure out how she fits into their understanding of what a woman is supposed to be. And usually that understanding is weak and submissive. And when the answer isn't obvious, that's when the scrutiny begins. So when we talk about fairness, we also have to talk about perception, about who we see as a threat and why. Right now, the narrative is not just that trans women might have an advantage. It's that they are a danger to women's sports. And that language is very important. It shapes how people think and feel and ultimately what policies they are going to support. And if we're being honest, a lot of that fear is not rooted in any data whatsoever. It's rooted in assumptions about gender and strength and what bodies are even capable of. And the people with these assumptions probably haven't got off their sofa in a week. Come on, people. And those assumptions don't just affect trans athletes. They affect all women, especially those who don't fit a narrow traditional, I hate the term traditional in general, but a traditional idea of femininity. So when people say this is about protecting women, that's when it's worth asking which women and at what cost. If protection comes at the expense of constant scrutiny, invasive testing, and questioning people's identities, then we have to ask whether that protection is actually happening at all, or just reinforcing the same systems that have always limited who women are allowed to be. Part 6. Genetics, intersex bodies, and the problem with testing. Now, we get to the part of this combo that I think completely changes everything because it forces us to confront something a lot of people don't even realize. The idea of biological sex being simple and obvious. It's not even close. Right now, part of the response to this issue is, well, we'll just test people. Test female athletes to make sure they're actually female. Simple solution, right? Just verify it, confirm it, move on. La-di-da, no biggie, except the second that you ask what that testing actually looks like, everything starts to fall apart. Because what are you testing? Stick with me here, though, okay? Science. What are you testing? Chromosomes, hormones, physical traits? Which one determines whether someone is really female? And what happens when those things don't all match up perfectly? Let's start with what most of us learned in school. XX chromosomes equal female. XY equal male. Easy, clean, done. Except that is a simplified version of biology that leaves out a lot of real world variation because human bodies are not always that predictable. There are people who are born with XY chromosomes but develop physically as female. They may go their entire lives identifying as women, living as women, and never even knowing that their chromosomes don't match what we typically expect. There are people with what's called mosaic genetics, where some of their cells are XX and others are XY. There are hormonal variations that affect how the body develops, how it responds, how it performs. All of this falls under the umbrella of what is known as intersex variations. And here's the part that really surprises people. This is not extremely rare. Estimates suggest that around 1 to 2% of the population has some form of intersex trait. That's roughly the same percentage of people who have red hair. So this is not some obscure 1 in a million situation. It's just something that we don't really talk about very often. And that's the same percentage as people who are trans. And here's where it connects back to sports. If you start implementing strict biological testing for female athletes and you are not just targeting transgender women, if you start implementing strict biological testing for female athletes, you are not just targeting transgender women. You are opening the door to scrutinizing any athlete whose body doesn't fit a narrow definition of female, including cisgender women who have done nothing but exist in the bodies that they were born with. And that's where things get very, very uncomfortable. Imagine training your entire life, competing at the highest level, identifying as a woman, living as a woman, and then being told that based on a test you didn't even know you needed to take, you no longer qualify. Not because you cheated, not because you broke a rule intentionally, but because your biology doesn't fit someone else's explanations. You could unknowingly have a different intersex kind of chromosome happening here. That's not just a policy. That's like a human issue. Historically, we've seen this before. Women in sports have been subjected to sex testing for decades, often in ways that were invasive, humiliating, and inconsistent. And those tests have disproportionately affected women who don't conform to traditional standards of femininity, women who are more muscular, more dominant, more physically exceptional. So when people say, let's just test them, what they're really saying is, let's simplify something that is not simple. They're trying to apply a clean binary solution to a reality that is messy, complex, and full of variation. Biology is not a strict binary, it's a spectrum. And the more you try to force it into two rigid categories, the more exceptions you uncover. And that is the paradox of this entire approach. The more we try to define real womanhood through biology alone, the more we realize that biology itself doesn't cooperate with those definitions. Now, we're in this position where in order to enforce fairness, we may end up creating a system that subjects more athletes to scrutiny, more athletes to testing, and more athletes to the possibility of being excluded, and not because they did anything wrong, but because they don't fit a definition that was never as clear as we thought that it was. That's why this matters beyond just transgender athletes. Once you open the door to defining who qualifies as a woman based on a specific biological marker, you don't get to control how far that goes. So when someone says it's simple, just test them, the reality is it's not simple, and it never has been. Part 7. Control, history, and the bigger picture. When you zoom out from all of this, the policies, the debates, the headlines, the arguments online, you start to see a pattern. And it's not a new pattern. It's actually something that we have seen before, just in a few different forms. Because the idea of regulating bodies, especially women's bodies, we know it's not new. It just evolves with the times. For as long as women have been allowed into competitive sports, there has always been anxiety around it. Questions about whether they belong, whether they're capable, whether they're too much or not enough. And when women start excelling, like really excelling and breaking records, outperforming expectations, the reaction wasn't always celebration. Sometimes it was suspicion. They got sus. Sometimes it was scrutiny. Sometimes it was, wait, how is she doing that? She must be trans. She had to be a man to be that fucking good. You are idiots. And that question, how is she doing that, has led to something pretty invasive and honestly, like, fucking disturbing practices in the past, okay? There were times when female athletes were subjected to physical examinations, chromosome testing, hormone testing, all in an attempt to verify that they were truly women. Imagine literally having to show your vagina to a doctor to verify you were indeed a woman because you are too good at something. And these tests were not consistent. As I said before, they weren't always scientific either. They were often very humiliating. More importantly, they revealed something about how we think about women in sports. The testing wasn't happening randomly. It was happening to women who stood out, women who didn't fit a certain image, women who were stronger, faster, better, more muscular, more dominant. In other words, women who challenged expectations. And that's the thread that connects past to present. Now, we're seeing a new version of that same instinct, a desire to define, to categorize, to draw lines around what is acceptable and what is not. And again, it's being framed as fairness. It's being framed as protection. But underneath that, there's still this underlying discomfort with bodies that don't fit neatly into some random ass white ass guy's expectations. This isn't just about sports. Sports are just the stage where this conversation is playing out. The real issue is so much broader. It's about how society is defining gender, who gets to belong, and who is seen as valid, as real, and as legitimate. I think what makes people uncomfortable about this conversation is that it forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding. It forces us to admit that maybe the categories we've relied on in our entire life are not as clear-cut as we thought. We have to give things names, we have to give things titles, categories, and that evolves over time. But there's this temptation to just like tighten them and reel everything back in to make them more strict, more controlled, more defined, because control feels safe, but we know control always comes at a cost. So now that we've walked through all of this, really, we got into the facts, some of the reactions out there, the numbers, the science, the history. This conversation is not going away. It's not going to be solved in one policy, one debate, or one viral post. It is very messy. It is going to continue evolving, and people are going to continue having very strong opinions about it. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to have better conversations about it. Right now, a lot of what's happening is people picking a side and digging in. No nuance, no curiosity, just certainty. They're so sure. And the problem with that is that certainty is not always earned. Sometimes it's just extremely loud. So let's do a little reality check. Not everything that is framed as protecting fairness is neutral. Sometimes it's influenced by deeper beliefs about gender and power. Sometimes it's sending a message. Sometimes there's not even a fucking rhyme or reason to it, and it's simply happening as a statement for something else. Not every concern is rooted in hate, but not every concern is rooted in fact either. And not every solution that sounds simple actually is simple. Because if there's one thing this entire conversation has made clear, it's that human biology, identity, and performance are all very complex, far more complex than we all like to think. Elite sports have never been fair. They've always been a space where natural advantages play a role. That's literally what makes someone elite. So when we start acting like fairness is something we can perfectly engineer, we're ignoring the reality of how sports actually work. And just again, most people talking about this issue are never going to be directly affected by it. They're not Olympic athletes. They're not competing at that level. A lot of them aren't even athletes at all, while news anchors sit behind their desk and either agree with this or disagree with it. they're not, for lack of a better term, on the front lines. They're not out there competing. They are just running their mouth thinking they know what they're talking about. And that is also worth paying attention to, because when people feel that strongly about something that doesn't even affect them, it usually means it's connected to something bigger. So if you take anything from this episode, let it be this: ask better questions, okay? Be willing to sit in a little bit of discomfort. Confusion actually is a good thing. It means your brain is at least open to kind of sorting through that confusion, and recognize that behind every policy, every headline, every debate, there are real people whose lives are being affected. Whether they're a large or small portion of the population, people fucking matter. And that should all matter. That people matter. People matter. That should matter. That people matter. That's all the hot air I have today. I'm sweating. I hope. Oh, my announcement. Tomorrow, today's Tuesday. If you're listening on March 31st, if you're listening on March 31st, and tomorrow's April 1st, 2026, it is the 1-year anniversary of Hot Air. So I am dropping a short little surprise episode, and it's not actually short either. It's about an hour-long surprise episode celebrating the 1 year. It's the first visuals in about 6 to 8-ish weeks. My podcast studio is sort of ready, not quite, but I was like, screw it. We can't start this next year of Hot Air without having some visuals for people to look forward to and watch on YouTube and watch on Instagram and all that fun stuff. So stay tuned. Maybe if I'm feeling it, you might get 3 episodes this week, which is, I don't think I've ever done that before. So who knows? But you're getting 2 episodes on Tuesday, which is today, and tomorrow on Wednesday, which is tomorrow. So make sure you're following me on Instagram and TikTok at _hotairpod. Visit my website, hotairwithjoshuarobert.com, to shop my merch, submit your listener stories, and topic suggestions. And I'll see you tomorrow. I might see you Friday, but I will definitely see you next Tuesday.